Today, we are launching a report by the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, or UNU-CPR, and the Freedom Fund. And this report explores the crucial intersection between the lack of official documentation and the risk of modern slavery. And just a little bit of a backstory as to how this came about. So the Freedom Fund engaged UNU-CPR about a year ago to try and look into this phenomenon because it's something that the Freedom Fund has observed throughout our programming across the world, including in Brazil, Kenya, and Nepal, which are three countries that we'll focus on in today's webinar. We've seen how not having access to legal documents often forces people into informal, dangerous, and exploitative work. And we also see that on the other side of it, once people are trapped in these situations of abuse and modern slavery, not having official documents also means that they cannot get legal protection or access support services. So it sort of traps people in a vicious cycle. And whilst we believe that this is a really important component and intervention for combating modern slavery, we don't see it talked about a lot in the research sphere or in programming, which is why we're really grateful to have been able to partner with you and UCPR to do this piece of research. So to help us unpack this critical and also complex issue, we have a really exciting lineup of speakers and experts joining us today to share their experiences. And today's webinar is structured into 4 sessions. So first, we'll hear an overview of the research at a global level. In session 2, we'll examine the impact of not having documentation with a deep dive into Brazil. Session 3, we will be diving into the many different ways that individuals can become undocumented. And finally, for our last session, we will also look at the potential policy solutions to address the challenges that we'll discuss today. And finally, as I mentioned, we will have time for Q&A at the end. So I really want to encourage all of you to submit your questions and comments to the speakers. And you can do this all throughout the session via the Q&A box. And you can also see and upvote questions that have been submitted by others as well. So also, before we jump into the session, just a gentle reminder to all of our speakers that we've allocated about 20 minutes for each of the sessions. So I want to make sure that we have ample time for Q&A at the end. So if you are running over time, I may have to gently interrupt your session in order to guide us along. So with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our first session, providing an overview of the research that will be led by Professor Heaven Crawley. So Heaven, please kick us off and over to you.
Thanks, Yuki. I'd just like to begin actually by thanking you, Yuki, and the Freedom Fund for commissioning this research. I think it's a really important area that's really neglected, and I'll explain why in a moment. I'd also really like to thank the country teams, and you'll hear more from them in the various sessions. They've done a phenomenal job of researching what is a really tricky and sensitive area, both the issues of documentation and the issues of modern slavery. And I think you'll hear from them about the complexity of this issue a little later on in this presentation and the session. I'm going to share this opening session with the lead researcher on this project, Ang Harrod Smith, and Harrod's going to just share, I think, our collective PowerPoint. And I'm just really going to begin by giving you a little bit of an overview of the issues that frame the research and the findings that you'll be hearing more about today. So next slide, please, Ang Harrod. I mean, I think the first thing to say is something to do with the scale of the problem. We know, because it's been recognized by the UN and by governments globally, that being documented is really important. It's reflected in Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, which specifically calls on governments to provide legal identity for all, including free birth registrations by 2030. So birth registrations is one of the key ways. It's not the only document that people can have, but the registration of births is critical. And in 2021, the World Bank estimated that around 1 in 9 of the world's population, around 850 million people, actually lack any official proof of their identity. Around half of this population are children, which is why I mentioned specifically the issue of birth certificates. And the majority reside in lower income countries within Africa and South Asia. Now, the data that we have, and it is quite patchy because by definition, this is an under-recognized group, but these data show that people from more disadvantaged groups, and that includes women, younger people, less educated people, rural dwellers, migrants, refugees, and those living in poverty, are much more likely to be without official documentation. And you'll hear more from our country partners about the different groups in the different countries that we looked at. At the same time, running in parallel to this problem of documentation, we know that around 50 million people, including more than 12 million children, are estimated to be in situations of modern slavery. And again, that's most likely to be a fairly significant underestimate. So we have these two bodies of research and evidence, one on documentation, one on modern slavery. But there's very little evidence, if you like, about the critical link between these two issues. And, for example, the increased risk of trafficking and exploitation that might be associated with a lack of documentation. And that's really why we were committing to do this work. Next slide, please. This figure, and it's a figure from the report, and I'm sure Yuki will share with you a link to the report very soon, gives you an indication of the level of access to identity documents globally in our focus countries. And you'll see there again that figure of 89% is a global average, but the low-income countries having less access for many people to documentation, and birth registration rates in our focus countries differing quite substantially. Next slide, please. So just a little bit by way of introduction to the research, and you can read much more about the methodology in the report itself. We undertook a global review of the existing evidence and of the data and policy documents, and that document was published in April of this year, and again can be found on the Freedom Fund website. During the course of the research, we undertook a total of 173 interviews in the 3 focus countries, Brazil, Kenya, and Nepal. And we also held a series of validation workshops to really validate the findings, but also engage stakeholders and others in actionable recommendations to enhance the fight against modern slavery. Next slide, please. This slide, again, is one from the report, which you can explore in more detail at your own leisure, is really trying to unpack the pathways by which people come to be undocumented. I think it's too simplistic to think that there is only one pathway to a lack of documentation. It's clear that there are multiple pathways and that these are also often overlapping and intersecting in different ways. I would say that in terms of our research, the report identifies really pathways B and C as being the most significant. That is to say, where governments deem people as not being legally entitled to documentation, or where populations are judged as failing to meet the eligibility criteria for documentation. These are the 2 reasons, either because people are unable to prove their identity and their relationship to a country, or where they're considered by a state not to be eligible, where people experience the most significant problems. But there's also a whole range of problems around the practical and social barriers to registering for documentation. I'm sure we're going to hear much more about that in the presentations that follow. Next slide, please. Just before I hand over to Angharad, I just want to say something about, in broad terms, about the relationships between documentation and debt status and modern slavery risks. I think it's clear from our research that in 3 areas, economic, social, and legal, we see that a lack of documentation really significantly increases the risks of modern slavery. So this is primarily in relation to access to employment and financial services, the kinds of sectors that people are working in and the wages that they do or don't get as a consequence, and their access to government and relief services. We also see, and you will hear about, isolation and discrimination experienced by those without documentation, educational barriers, and of course, gender-specific vulnerabilities, which render some people more liable to be vulnerable to modern slavery where they don't have documentation. And you'll also hear about the legal inefficiencies, the systemic inefficiencies that mean that even where people are entitled to documentation, they often really struggle to get access to those documents. They may have a lack of legal support, they may struggle with language barriers, and again, we see the impacts of gender discriminatory laws. So there's a whole range of consequences for people of that. The psychological and physical impacts are very clear in terms of their mental health, their physical health, and of course, in terms of social exclusion. And that social exclusion, that restricted access to education, employment, and political participation, of course, makes it even more difficult for people to be able to take any kind of actions to redress their situation when it comes to their vulnerability to modern slavery. And with that, I'll just hand over to Ang Harrod, and who'll move on to talking more about some of the policy recommendations that the report identifies.
Good morning, afternoon, everyone. As Heaven mentioned, I will be sharing key findings from our global study, highlighting some of the best practices and strategies identified by international actors to address the challenges surrounding the link between a lack of documentation and modern slavery. Our research points to the need for unifying global efforts to improve documentation systems and protect vulnerable populations, requiring stronger collaboration across sectors and integration of identity initiatives with modern slavery prevention. Crucial to this is first understanding the problem. Global respondents highlighted significant gaps in data regarding the number of individuals without documentation, which hampers targeted interventions. Accurate data is essential for informing policies, allocating resources, and developing strategies to address these challenges. Without it, it is difficult to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of interventions aimed at increasing documentation access and protecting vulnerable populations. Several strategies were identified to address these gaps, as shown on the screen, and these include implementing national and regional surveys to identify and document undocumented individuals, developing integrated data management systems, engaging grassroots organizations in the data collection process, providing training on standard operating procedures, and finally advocating for the inclusion of data collection and management in national action plans and policy frameworks. Secondly, we must address and raise awareness of the nexus of documentation status and modern slavery risks. Findings from the global study noted that there are often differences in awareness levels and the ways in which different sets of policymakers and advocates approach the issue of documentation in the context of modern slavery. Despite the overlap in their work, often there is insufficient collaboration, which can lead to fragmented practices. Discussions with legal identity experts revealed that while civil registration is recognised as key to accessing services, its role in reducing trafficking risks is often vaguely acknowledged and lacks strong evidence. Respondents also noted varying levels of understanding within national government departments, influenced by their focus areas or the context in which they work. For example, it was perceived that border management were generally aware of the issue of exploitation, whilst some national ID officials were perceived to prioritise business processes over human rights concerns. Respondents therefore stressed the need for a holistic human rights approach, better system integration, and stronger cross-sector collaboration to protect vulnerable populations from modern slavery. Evidence also underscores the need for a multi-sectoral approach to engage communities and grassroots actors, raise awareness, counter discrimination, and enact legal reforms. By shifting these power relationships and empowering affected individuals, a more inclusive and effective approach can be developed to tackle the issues associated with a lack of official documentation. For instance, effective human rights campaigns led by individuals with lived experience, such as Nepal's Citizenship Amendment Bill and Malaysia's citizenship reforms for overseas-born children, demonstrate the power of grassroots efforts combined with governmental collaboration. Moreover, enhancing community understanding of the documentation process and building trust in government systems are crucial for sustained progress, whilst forming partnerships with NGOs and civil society organisations is key to overcoming some of these challenges. Our findings further emphasise the need for tailored support services for vulnerable populations, such as providing legal clinics, paralegal programs, and tailoring mobile registration units to remote areas. Training local officials and legal frameworks and marginalized groups' needs is also essential as new policies are implemented. Effective collaboration between governments, NGOs, and international organizations ensures well-resourced, accessible services. Technological solutions, whilst promising, face hurdles such as inadequate infrastructure and digital literacy gaps. To overcome these challenges, respondents stress that digital identity programs must be tailored to the specific needs of affected communities, enhancing accessibility and inclusivity. Additionally, the study stressed the importance of civil and birth registration for access to legal identity. Finally, while there are strong calls for sustained international cooperation and funding to support legal identity initiatives, many strategies face obstacles such as limited funding, insufficient political will, and the challenge of aligning national policies with international standards. Furthermore, certain government policies may inadvertently undermine efforts to increase access to official documentation. In the upcoming sessions, our country partners will delve into these challenges and share examples of best practices from their respective countries. However, across all contexts, our findings consistently show that the most effective practices involve inclusive and participatory policy development that both aligns with international standards, but also incorporates a systematic gender and equity lens. Having outlined some of the challenges and best practices identified during the global study, I now outline 5 key strategic areas that offer the most promising policy interventions to address this relationship. These include enhancing support services, promoting community engagement, improving data collection, strengthening collaboration, and addressing policy gaps. Together, these strategies can ensure basic rights and protections for all. Thank you for your attention, and I'll now pass over to Tanya, who is the statistician and civil registration and vital statistics lead at United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. She'll be providing insights from the legal identity community, and we'll be sharing some of the work that ESCAP is doing to address these documentation challenges. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you so much. And first of all, a huge thank you to UNU and the Freedom Fund for doing this research. It is extremely important. And I have to admit that when I first heard about the research, I got very excited because I've been working on CRVS, or civil registration and vital statistics, for over a decade. And for many years, we've been talking about the importance of birth registration to avoid issues of trafficking and modern-day slavery, but actually we have had very little evidence. So it is really fantastic to see this very thorough research being conducted. So yeah, huge thank you for that. What I also really appreciate about this report is, first of all, it really outlines some very structured approaches, looking at the different kind of aspects. I really like the way that it divides up, looking at, the economics aspects, the social aspects, and the legal aspects, and so on. I think it resonates very well with the work that the global community is doing to support increased civil registration and vital statistics across the world. And it's very nice how well it's been structured in here. I also really like the voices from the affected communities, and I think this is something that we in general needs to be a lot better at doing. Globally, and my particular area of work is in Asia and the Pacific, we have seen quite dramatic improvements in birth and death registration over the last decade, but there's still some huge gaps. And what we also need to remember, and what I think this report also is really good at highlighting, is that when we start having countries with higher rates of registration, the people who are excluded are even more excluded, right? If you live in a society where you only have 40 or 50% who have a birth certificate, the impact on your life of not having a birth certificate is quite limited. But if you live in a society where you have 90, 95% registered, if you are amongst those few people who are not registered, you are additionally excluded because everything evolves around that documentation. So I think this is really important element to keep in mind as well. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight some of the work that is ongoing to support some of the recommendations that are given in this report. First of all, I wanted to highlight the international recommendations on statelessness statistics, which is some fantastic work that UNHCR has been leading, but also with a lot of other partners. And I think it is really important to start getting some of that data that you mentioned in the report. It basically gives recommendations on definitions, how to collect this data, which kind of tabulations we need to do, and so on. And from a statistician's point of view, having those kind of standards makes a really big difference. So it's very nice to see that work has happened and is now being implemented in countries as well. A little bit of self-promotion as well. SCAP has been leading some work on trying to assess who are the people who are not registered, basically using quantitative methods in multiple countries in Asia and the Pacific. But I think this kind of qualitative research that you have conducted here adds such an in-depth lens to these inequalities. And I think it is really important. I mean, I'm a statistician, so I like data and numbers, but this qualitative information just gives so much more depth. So it's really adds a lot to the global discourse on this. And I think in general, I mean, this is a really important piece of research, but I think in general, we need a lot more research on civil registration and vital statistics, in particular on the reasons people are excluded on purpose or just because of lack of awareness or other issues. There's also a lot of other areas in service that needs additional research. And then finally, I think the call for additional engagement with communities is really important. In Asia and the Pacific, we are fairly lucky because the region in general has quite a strong commitment to civil registration and vital statistics. We are currently at the end of the Asia-Pacific CRVS decade. We will have a ministerial conference next year in June 25, where the governments in our region will come together again to kind of recommit to improve civil registration and vital statistics. And part of the preparations for that is a forum for civil society, children and youth that will happen in March next year, again, to really put a focus on these voices of the people who are actually affected by this. So yeah, once again, huge thank you for the great work, and I really look forward to seeing this disseminated widely. Thank you so much.
Thanks ever so much, Tanya. I think it's really affirming to know that this is going to be used, this work, because as you say, there's very little that's written on it, and completely agree. The voices of those communities that are most affected are really the most important and the ones that are often absent. So I'm really delighted that we're going to be handing over now to our country partners to bring in some of those voices. So thank you very much. And Yuki, back to you. Thank you.
Well, Heaven and Harad, Tanya, thank you so much for that insightful overview of the research. And it is truly alarming that there's 850 million people around the world without access to basic documentation. For our next session, we're now going to delve into the specific impacts of being undocumented with a focus on Brazil. So our next session will be led by Professor Louis Hans Messelin, who is co-author of this report. Hans, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Rowe. I thank you, everybody, for being here and for listening to our discussions today. And in the context of Brazil, it was a very powerful partnership between INURED, the Inter-University Institute for Research and Development, has done with the colleagues in Brazil, with many centers that are providing services to people who are at risk for modern slavery. And one thing that is important for us was the fact that through this partnership, we were able to identify with these actors in the field the challenges that they are facing, the contradictions sometimes that are at play in the context in which they find themselves. And we are going to have in our presentation today a part of, after I do my introductions, Dr. Victor Jasper is going to, just give you a summary of our findings in Brazil. And of course, you will find more that when you go to the documentations that is available to us. The second part of it will be from Ms. Carla Aparecida. And she's the executive director, not, the manager, executive manager of CAMI, which is a Centro de Apoio e Pastoral de Imigrante in Brazil, in one of the centers that is doing a lot of work in Brazil. So first of all, I would say that in general, we found out that the challenges associated with lack of documentation are profoundly linked with citizenship conditions of many of those at-risk populations, particularly the Haitians, Bolivians, Venezuelans. And second, we found also that the lack of documentation, the status of being a migrant and immigrants without paper is one thing, but also there are some populations that have been continuously marginalized in Brazilian society, particularly Afro-descent populations in certain places in Brazil. Of course, some indigenous populations, so that the conditions, socioeconomic conditions, compound the barriers that people are facing in order to obtain documentations. And thirdly, there is also the whole idea of where you live in the level of access that you can have. In the context of Brazil, geography plays a huge role because, of course, the control of the space and the capillary power of the institutions and the states is not the same in each specific region. So we found that where you live can be a powerful determinant on the conditions, of vulnerability to modern slavery. Ultimately, also we discussed during the report the bureaucratic challenges and inefficiencies that are faced, but not just in Brazil, but in many places on Earth that where we have either conducted the study where we have reviewed what exists already as a documentation. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to Victor, Dr. Victor Jasper. So he's going to provide in Portuguese a summary of our studies. Please, Victor, if you don't mind, go ahead.
Bom dia. Como professor Marcelão, eu vou fazer minha fala em português. Eu gostaria inicialmente de agradecer ao Freedom Fund e à ONU pela oportunidade, por ter participado dessa pesquisa. Foi uma experiência incrível, foi muito interessante mesmo. Também agradeço ao professor Marcelão e à Carla pela parceria aqui hoje e ao longo do trabalho. E bem, acho que eu gostaria só de salientar alguns aspectos iniciais para dar um pouquinho de contexto, reforçar algumas coisinhas que o professor Marcelão já comentou. A gente fez um foco aqui no Brasil de trabalhar com comunidades imigrantes, especialmente com imigrantes haitianos, na cidade de São Paulo. Mas o nosso trabalho também abarcou imigrantes venezuelanos, bolivianos e filipinos, e trabalhamos também com pessoas que estavam vivendo no estado do Paraná e no Rio Grande do Sul, além do estado de São Paulo. Inicialmente, as pessoas que trabalham com a questão migratória aqui no Brasil reconhecem que o Brasil possui uma legislação migratória considerada progressista, que tem feito um esforço ativo para que haja regularização dos principais grupos que migraram para o Brasil nos últimos 10 anos. E aqui eu digo principalmente haitianos e venezuelanos. Ainda que agora, por exemplo, a gente esteja vendo um fluxo grande de imigrantes, por exemplo, angolanos, e que só recentemente a gente conseguiu avançar no processo de regularização migratória desses imigrantes. Então, assim, apesar do Brasil ter uma legislação migratória considerada por muitos progressista, isso não significa que não exista uma série de desafios nesse processo de documentação. E o que a gente percebeu no campo foi justamente isso. Como o professor Marcelo bem destacou, há toda uma questão burocrática que tem dificultado muito o processo de regularização e de documentação desses imigrantes. Isso passa naquilo que a gente chamou de documentos que geram documentos. Então, nesse processo de documentação, para além da questão territorial, da questão muitas vezes financeira, você demandado a essas pessoas que possuam uma série de documentos anteriores que elas tragam, por exemplo, dos seus países para que elas consigam se documentar no Brasil. Então, para aquelas pessoas que já possuíam uma certa vulnerabilidade social no seu país de origem e que, por vezes, já não tinham acesso a alguns documentos lá, faz com que elas também não consigam ter acesso a documentos no Brasil e não consigam se documentar aqui. E isso gera um grande número de problemas para essas pessoas, porque toda e qualquer política pública que o governo possa prover, em alguma medida, vai ser exigido dessas pessoas, mesmo quando por lei não é necessário, mas por vezes vai ser requisitado dessa pessoa a apresentação de documentos. Isso faz com que as pessoas indocumentadas aqui no Brasil, elas tenham muito mais dificuldade de acessar serviços públicos, de acessar políticas sociais, e de saúde e de educação. De tal modo que o que a gente percebe é que você acaba aumentando ainda mais a vulnerabilidade social e econômica dessas pessoas. Também é importante destacar que a falta de documentação, o que a gente percebeu é que ela gera um grande impacto para as pessoas no acesso ao mercado de trabalho. O acesso ao mercado de trabalho se torna bastante complicado para aquelas pessoas que não possuem documento, porque as vagas que elas podem acessar no mercado de trabalho são vagas muito mais precarizadas. Isso num contexto em que a gente já enfrenta no Brasil um grande problema de desregulamentação e flexibilização do trabalho. Também adicionaria, nesse sentido, que, e aí acho que essa é uma questão importante para a gente aqui, é que imigrantes indocumentados, eles se tornam muito mais vulneráveis à escravidão moderna. Isso foi perceptível na nossa pesquisa também. De tal forma, e Carla vai poder falar isso um pouco mais profundamente do que eu, isso é mobilizado frequentemente por esses empregadores exploradores, que vão ameaçar as pessoas indocumentadas, dizendo: se você me denunciar, eu te denuncio antes e você vai ser deportado. Ainda que isso não ocorra, mas ainda assim isso é usado como uma forma de ameaça para que essas pessoas não denunciem as condições de exploração a quais elas estão submetidas. Eu diria que a gente enfrenta uma grande dificuldade no Brasil e que uma estratégia fundamental para a gente é dar o máximo de visibilidade à questão migratória. Hoje, a questão migratória é uma questão bastante invisível na sociedade brasileira, o que faz com que as dificuldades e os problemas enfrentados pelos imigrantes muitas vezes não sejam reconhecidos pelo corpo social brasileiro. Então, trazer visibilidade para essa população é fundamental, e isso é um trabalho que é continuamente feito pelas redes de atendimento a imigrantes. Eu encerro por aqui, agradeço mais uma vez a oportunidade e passo a palavra para a Carla. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Vitor. Bom dia a todos. Para mim é um grande prazer e gostaria de agradecer não somente ao Vitor, mas também ao professor e a todos os presentes que está sendo possível falar sobre esse tema, não somente no Brasil, né? Eu sou Carla, eu sou assistente social, pós-graduada e trabalho com imigrantes e refugiados há quase 30 anos aqui em São Paulo, né? É importante salientar que ultimamente nós estamos atendendo no pós-resgate. Além de trabalhar na prevenção, nós atendemos no pós-resgate. Em um ano, nós atendemos 131 vítimas do trabalho escravo. Então, eu gostaria de trazer esse desafio. E aí, não só brasileiras, porque entra também, mas argentina, bolivianas, colombianas, equatorianas, iranianas e peruanas, e ainda um grande número de homens, que é 84 homens e 47 mulheres. E quais são esses segmentos? Da construção civil, lava rápido, oficinas de costura, restaurante, agricultura e doméstica. Tem as suas particularidades e desafios na questão de gênero, e mais particularidades porque a gente trabalha aqui no Brasil, nós temos ainda enraizado e uma transversal de uma estrutura que é a questão do racismo, que é uma questão transversal, e ainda nós colhemos frutos na escravidão moderna, porque quando se fala da empregada doméstica também, todas são negras. E nós trabalhamos também no pós-resgate, que é dando o abrigo para essas pessoas que são resgatadas, o retorno se ela quer retornar para o país de origem ou para o estado de origem, e os mais diversos tipos de acompanhamentos. Qual que é o maior desafio? Documentação. Por que a documentação? Porque quando ele não tem documento, ele não tem escolha, porque isso não é uma escolha. Ele vem através de um sonho e esse sonho se torna um pesadelo. Se ele não tem documento, ele vai, sim, para um trabalho que é geralmente de exploração. E aí existe um problema muito sério, que é a falta de políticas públicas específico para o atendimento a vítimas do trabalho escravo. Pois existe essa transversal que deveria ser trabalhada. Nós não temos um lugar específico para atender vítimas. Nós não temos ainda sensibilidade do poder público para olhar, por exemplo, por que os imigrantes estão sem documentos? E não é só imigração que não tem acordo com o Brasil. Às vezes, no Brasil, a gente tem um tratado chamado Mercosul, que as pessoas poderiam estar com documento e estão sem documentos. E elas vão acabar sendo, de novo, escravizadas, né? Então, tem algo aí que a gente sempre pergunta para a gente mesmo, o que está por trás disso? Por que as pessoas são negociáveis? Por que elas estão... Por que é muito fácil eu ameaçar ela com o próprio documento? Olha, se você não trabalhar uma dívida, uma passagem que custa, sei lá, vamos supor, R$100, eles vão pagar R$1.000. Ou seja, eles têm que trabalhar o ano inteiro para pagar uma passagem que não custou nem R$100, às vezes. E isso acontece com os imigrantes e com os migrantes. Pasmem. São Paulo, por exemplo, a capital que eu estou, também traz migrantes de outros estados para trabalhar aqui, nos mais diversos segmentos. E aí, uma coisa que é bem interessante, a gente está falando de documentação e também os documentos dos brasileiros, eles estão sem documentos. Então, é um problema que vai muito além. Eu sempre falo, além dos muros institucionais, existe um problema que as pessoas não olham, né? E não adianta trabalhar somente na prevenção se eu não trabalhar em rede e se eu não trabalhar as políticas públicas, se eu não trabalhar o advocacy. Por quê? Essas pessoas, se eu tiro ela do trabalho escravo, ela vai voltar, porque ela vai voltar para o local de origem. E se ela não tiver um apoio, ela vai acabar voltando para o ciclo do trabalho escravo. E aqui em São Paulo, nós mesmos já acolhemos várias pessoas que já foram para o trabalho escravo, não somente uma vez. E todas as vezes que a gente resgata, ela está sem o documento. Porque o documento dela também valida que ela já passou por alguns lugares. Então, uma coisa interessante de se pensar e se perguntar, mas quantas dessas autoridades realmente querem combater o trabalho escravo moderno e o tráfico de pessoas? Quantos querem investidos em cada país que está aqui? É investido a mesma quantidade e vontade daqueles que estão comandando a lei. Então, a gente olha para os imigrantes. Aqui nós temos uma transversal ainda que nós colhemos dos antepassados, que não existe mais o trabalho escravo, como era no passado, mas nós estamos retomando um trabalho escravo, principalmente com as mudanças e a flexibilização das leis trabalhistas que passaram a existir no Brasil. Nós perdemos muito. E aí vem os imigrantes para trabalhar de uma forma totalmente irregular, uma exploração do trabalho, sem nenhum documento, fazendo com que eles trabalhem horas e mais horas, e muitas das redes desses segmentos que eu falei, cada vez mais ricos. E as pessoas, e pasmem, nós já tivemos pessoas que chegaram também a falecer de exaustão por trabalho análogo de escravo. Então, a gente precisa olhar com cuidado. E nós, infelizmente, Para esse tipo de trabalho, aqui a gente não tem financiamento, né? Então, nós trabalhamos sempre com projetos, as instituições, e todas, sem exceção. Então, é bem complicado não existir uma política pública específica e a gente ter casos extremos de morte por exaustão. E não foram só uma, né? E, principalmente, uma coisa que pouco falado é a questão também psicológica dessas pessoas. Pessoas que saíram, foram resgatadas e tentaram suicídio. Então, eu termino a minha fala aqui, o quanto nós precisamos ainda trabalhar em rede, e o quanto nós precisamos regularizar as pessoas, e o quanto nós precisamos falar, sim, do trabalho análogo de escravo. Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Carla. And with that, we are going to close our session. But I just want to, mention some points here that have been very salient here. And I think in the context of
Oh,
Professor,
Franz, for some reason we cannot hear you.
can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me now?
Oh, I think it's
I can hear him.
Same.
sorry.
Yeah,
Go on, Hans,
you can.
sorry.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, and to meet up the time, I'm going to be a little brief. I want to highlight here the point here that the study has, led us to pinpoint. It is the continuum of vulnerability, the kind of path dependency from the country of origins, being a migrant, somebody who has had some difficulty to have paper in their own countries and coming to Brazil and being vulnerable, and this reproduces itself. The second one is the path dependency from Brazil itself, with the history that most of us may know about, countries that has gone out of, like many countries in America, slavery, marginalizations, and racism, and all those social historical processes, combine to create more barriers and obstacles for access to documentation. But at the same time, Brazil, has shown itself as one of the countries with the most, progressive laws protecting the vulnerable populations. However, those laws that have been enacted in many areas ultimately leads to haven't been able to be put in practice. So there's the need for public policies that address, those that can help enact those laws and make it effective in people's life. And thank you very much. And I know that you may have questions later, and I pass it to Ms. Law. Hello, Yuki.
Yes, thank you so much to Carla, Hans, and Victor. Thank you for sharing your experiences from Brazil and highlighting the devastating impact of being undocumented. And I really want to echo Carla's point that a lot of the causes for people becoming undocumented and falling to modern slavery are systemic. Meanwhile, a lot of the interventions are often project-based and ad hoc. And I really, hope that we can maybe delve into some of that mismatches in the following sessions and also as part of the Q&A. Next, we're going to trace back to the various pathways that can lead someone to becoming undocumented. The next session will have a focus on Kenya. And so I'd like to welcome our next chair, Dr. Linda Ocho, also a co-author of this No Identity, No Protection report. So Linda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Yuki. Can you hear me? Okay, great. No, thank you so much to Freedom Fund and Heaven and Angard for this opportunity to actually be part of this research team. I think it was a very interesting insight on what we were focusing on in terms of understanding the linkages between modern slavery and lack of documentation. So my presentation is going to focus on what is section 2 of the report. And if you recall the image that was shared by Heaven and Angard on the pathways to lack of documentation. So I'll talk to you about some of the evidence we found in Kenya, but also in the report, you'll find evidence from Nepal and Brazil on the different subgroups that we're looking at. And in this particular intervention, we wanted to better understand how individuals become undocumented and the different scenarios. And if you saw from that flow chart, it kind of gave us an idea of the different ways in which people can lack documentation because of their position in society, and that includes migrants, nationals, asylum seekers and refugees, but also migrant workers who are present in Kenya, for example. This work would have not been possible without my co-researcher Veronica Mwangi and the support with Azadi community, as well as Refugee Legal Network, among others. I think they gave us some deep insights on how we can understand the issues on lack of documentation, but as well as modern slavery. So if you recall, Heaven had mentioned that there was a report that we published in April 2024 that basically gave us some idea of what is the evidence out there in terms of lack of documentation and modern slavery. And through that, we're able to interrogate the different pathways existing in terms of legal pathways to documentation. At the same time, we're able to identify the different subgroups, such as the stateless persons. I've seen questions about that on the Q&A. And also the different the challenges nationals are actually facing in terms of modern slavery. So you can refer to that report for more details. In this particular intervention, I'm going to focus on the 6 categories that Heaven had mentioned. And that was, I'll repeat them, people who are consciously undocumented, people who are deemed not legally entitled by the government, those who fail to meet eligibility criteria for documentation, those who face practical and social barriers to register for documentation, those who are waiting to receive documentation, as well as documentation that has been lost or confiscated. So what we're finding in the case of Kenya, there were varied experiences that we're getting from the different subcategories. As mentioned, we looked at nationals who are in the country who lack documentation, migrant workers, as well as asylum seekers and refugees in the country. So in terms of the first one, in terms of those who are consciously undocumented, we noted that there are some people who are in hard to reach locations that do not have access to the registration centers to be able to register births or even deaths. But also the cost of actually accessing those registration centers pose a barrier. So they made a conscious decision not to register their children at birth, which begins the process of lack of documentation for some of these families. And you'd find maybe 2 or 3 generations of household members that do not have documentation because they consciously did not take an active approach towards registering their children at birth. But also there's that aspect of the bureaucratic process of accessing these documentation, the essential. In Kenya, like the other regions, birth registration and getting the birth certificate is quite critical for other documentation thereafter, such as a national ID and passport. Without a birth certificate, you cannot get an ID and you cannot get a passport. So this is quite important, and it actually identified the low registration amongst participants in Kenya. The second category are those who are deemed to be not legally entitled by the government to access these documentation. And these are mostly migrants who are under the radar, the ones that we discovered that are working in the country and may have accessed the country through the legal pathways and got their registration, got job opportunities, but their documents have been retained by the employer. And now they face the risk of being deported if they are not found to be legally present in the country. Now, this is common, I'm sure, in other countries, and this is an aspect that there's a lot of advocacy taking place in terms of nationals or migrants being able to keep their own documents. And we did see some of these people, especially women, domestic workers, who are actually experiencing these challenges. In terms of category C, those are those who fail eligibility criteria. And this was very interesting because we found this amongst border communities as well as orphans. Now, this is some study that is actually under research, what we found in the literature. We found that a lot of those who live at the border communities between Kenya and Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania, Kenya and Somalia, were finding difficulties obviously training their lineage, or they didn't have the documentation of their parents to show that they have a Kenyan heritage. So this actually made them fail some eligibility criteria, despite the fact that the Constitution of Kenya allows inheritance of your nationality through both parents and not just the father, which was the previous constitution. So it's a bit of a challenge, especially when they have to go through the vetting process. And you'll hear more about it when I invite Ben to talk about his experience but also the experiences at his organization. So I will not go into so much detail because I would want you to hear the voices of someone who has gone through that process. Then we have the other category of those who are facing practical and social barriers to register. Now here we found different scenarios where these practical and social barriers exist. One was lacking awareness and knowledge of how to go through the process of documenting. I think we all assume that once information is available on the World Wide Web, it should be available and understood by different populations, but we need to also understand some people do not, may have issues understanding the language, most don't speak English, and also just need to know the simplified version of actually getting that documentation. But there's also bureaucratic obstacles that are in the way of the registration process. I mentioned the fact that some of the offices are quite distant. They have to have multiple visits. They have to resubmit or submit new documents that are being introduced. That actually frustrates the process of getting documentation. This also can be linked to the vetting process of some of the respondents had mentioned that it can be very tedious in the sense they have to prove that they are Kenyan national, and we'll hear that when I invite Ben. But there are also practical barriers such as the cost and distance of the office, and also discrimination and social norms around gender, ethnicity, religion that we identified in the case of Kenya. This was very common amongst orphans and those who live in the border community. And the last two categories that were people waiting to receive documents, as well as people whose documentation had been lost and taken away. We saw this more common amongst displaced population. So when an asylum seeker or refugee is waiting for their documents to be processed, they do not have anything that shows evidence that they have been recognized as a refugee, or they're under the asylum process. They only have a paper document that may not be recognized by all stakeholders. So that means they're denied access to some basic services such as health. They may not be able to access education opportunities, among others, but also some are looking for livelihood opportunities. And when you don't have any documents that prove who you are, you're put in a dire position. And in the case of those who have lost their documentation, we had reports of respondents saying that their documentation had been confiscated from them, from law enforcement or from an employer that they had gotten employment from. And this caused more problems for them and putting them at risk at modern slavery. So the report actually illuminates a lot of these issues in Nepal, in Kenya, and in Brazil. But I just thought I would just flag these as critical issues that had been identified in Kenya. And now I'd like to invite Ben to come in and give his perspective. Ben is actually a youth advocate at Mono Africa. And Ben, I would like to invite him to share some of his insights on this report. And I just have a few questions for Ben. So Ben, are you there? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here. I can hear you.
Okay, Ben.
Yes.
Ben, thank you for joining us during this launch. I wanted us to just hear from you about the documents you were lacking and the impact it had on you when you were trying to get the documents, like the pathways you used to get the documents.
Yes. Hi again. I'm Benato from UNU Africa, Kenya, and the process of me getting my documentation, that is the national ID card, was quite tedious, and it was quite interesting. Interesting in a way that the process of getting the documentation was longer for me because there was an interesting fact that I come from a border community. And when you come from a border community, the system gradually mutates. And in a way, you feel like it's going against you in acquiring your documentation. I had to go through verification of my birth certificate, which is a primary document in acquiring all the other documents. I had to go for several of the verifications, which took months. I had to go for a vetting process, which also took months and inconvenienced me. I could not get a job. I couldn't get higher education. And I couldn't even get some of the health services that were important in my life. And this process just made a whole lot of frustrations, and even my self-esteem went down because I couldn't even move out in the risk of what if I meet with a police officer and he asks for the ID? What do I tell him? You see, such kind of things made me isolate myself in a way that it was so disturbing in a way. Then during this period also, the kind of services that the service providers gave was unsatisfying, because the comments they made, they showed that they didn't have dignity they didn't respect the dignity of other human beings. And this put me in a position of even wanting to give up on acquiring my own documentation. And I almost gave up. And someone had, advised me to go to my rural home and try and restart the process from there. But as I went there, I went through another humiliation of having to speak my native language, and I'm born in the city and raised in the city. So I don't recall, or I don't even know how to speak fluently in my native language, which was very, very embarrassing for me. So I gave up and came back to Nairobi and start the process all over again. Not forgetting you have to bribe one person here in this office and there. So it was kind of disturbing. And after getting the national ID, it was just a sigh of relief. So it was an interesting process, I can say. And the government and other bodies need to really look into people coming from the border communities, the orphans, and even look deeper into integrating these services so that we don't have to travel back to the rural home and be subjected to speaking your native language, which you don't know. It's just very, very hectic. The systems need to be integrated, and the service providers need to be put in a way that they respect whoever they are serving, regardless of their age, of their tribe, of their gender or religion. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much, Ben. Maybe to give also the audience some context, how did you manage to get your ID? I mean, what pathway did work for you? Because I can see from your experience, you use so many pathways, including going back to your rural home, but which one opened the door for you to get the ID?
I had to go to the Assistant Commissioner's office in Mathare. That's where I got my help from a very good well-wisher. I think she was my guardian angel. She works in the office. She recommended the necessary pathways. She was very honest. She recommended, she taught me the process, and I followed. And eventually, I got the ID. So I had to go through a commissioner's office, which shouldn't be the case for other people. What if someone doesn't know the commissioner? You see? So that's what worked for me. I went to the commissioner, he talked to someone who also knew someone, and it worked.
So it seems that you've gone through a lot that at least has put you in that position as a youth advocate to guide other young people who may be facing similar challenges. And it would be good to just give a small overview of how you've done that at Maono. I know we may be pressed for time, but it would be good for the audience to sort of know that this service is being provided or supported by local organizations.
Yes, not just I go through this, many of our youths in our community go through it. And we've managed to help so many, whereby we do referrals. We refer them to the necessary documentation offices, and they go there and they receive the necessary help. We've also trained them on the necessary pathways of getting documented. We also have a very good rapport with the offices. Just here next to our organization, we have the chief's office. So in the we also create a good rapport whereby if we refer someone and they say they are from Maono, they get the services at a very faster rate, and that's how we try and curb the issue of lacking documentation among youths and children in our community.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben, for that. I think this helps us to kind of get an idea of what's going on the ground. There's a lot to unpack in this report, and you can actually read more details about it in the report. It will help us to grow and actually focus on what it needs to be done going forward to open the doors. So I think I would hand over to Yuki. I don't know if we've gone over time. I've not seen your camera on, so I assume we haven't, but over to you, Yuki.
Thank you, Linda. And actually, no, you are right on time. Thank you so much for presenting the findings from Kenya, Linda. And Ben, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. And I think it's so important to highlight that it's not just the fact that there are legal barriers, but even when access is theoretically possible, as Ben's experience highlights, that there are a lot of other logistical costs, as well as sort of discriminatory requirements that mean that people cannot get access to their identity documents. So thank you so much for highlighting that. And I really do hope that we can also revisit that as part of our Q&A. On that note, before I turn to my final session, I just want to remind everyone that we will have Q&A starting in about 20 minutes. So please submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll try and get through them and turning over to the various speakers also to answer your questions. So now we move into our final session, where we'll explore policy solutions to tackle the links between a lack of documentation and modern slavery. And this session will focus on the poor, examining actions that can be taken at a local, national, and international level. So please welcome our final panel, which will be chaired by Anita Gimere, who is also one of the co-authors of the No Identity, No Protection report. So Anita, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yuki. Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Freedom Fund, Yuki, and the team, and also the Freedom Fund team in Nepal, Heaven and Angad, for the opportunity for this important research. I would also like to mention the support we have received from different communities in Rauthat and Saptari, particularly from the Harwa Charwa community, and the local government and civil society in Bardia, who has very much helped us with the work. A small amendment, Yuki. Vishnu sir is from ward number 11. I think it was me who provided the wrong information. I'm sorry about that. Going back to our panel, you have asked us to highlight some of the important policy solutions, and I'm going to present from the Nepal case study. I know that there's a lot to do, but I'd like to highlight on some of the very important steps that has been taken in the recent years in providing citizenship or providing access to citizenship to the people. I'm going to highlight 4 good practices, and then I'm going to hand the floor to Vishnu sir to discuss some of the local good practices that they have been doing in the context of Bardia to address some of the issues related to citizenship. So in case of Nepal, I think the first good practice is related to the current amendment in the Citizenship Act. So this current Citizenship Act amendment has changed the long-held discriminatory practices related, for example, to gender, where women were not allowed to pass their citizenship to their children, children born to migrant women who could not give their citizenship to their children, passing of documents by other groups. So all these have been addressed in the current policy, at least, even though there are some challenges with the actual implementation of the act. The second important thing I would like to mention as a good practice is passing the jurisdiction of decision making to the local government. So, for example, a local committee comprised of 5 people can provide referral for citizenship now. So it makes it easier for people who have been living in the local area, who are quite well known to the local representatives. They don't have to depend on the federal government to kind of refer to their citizenship. The third important step I would like to mention is removing practical barriers to address lack of access to citizenship. So, for example, some local government have removed the fees for application forms so that it helps if people are not able to access citizenship because of economic reasons. And finally, working on the contextual socio-cultural norm change and putting it on practice by the local government. So for example, one of the important challenge in birth registration for children living in border areas is the mothers would not have the citizenship because they have been married like from India, and there is a specific years that they have to need to spend in Nepal to get the citizenship, which is 5 years now. And also there are other reasons why they do not have citizenship. So this has the local government has been registering the childbirth even when the mother does not have the citizenship. This was not the case previously, and this change has helped many children to get their citizenship, to get their admission in schools and continue their education, as well as access other benefits. So these are some of the good practices that we have been seeing in the recent years. Most importantly, after federalization and across the study sites, there have been important initiatives by local government where they have issued interim identity documents for people without citizenship. These interim documents have helped children get admitted to schools and continue their education. It has helped people cross border, so enhanced their mobility, because it is a local practice in the areas which border between Nepal and India, that livelihoods are multi-local. People travel between the two countries for their livelihood, for work, for seasonal migration. And in some cases, the local government has also distributed social security allowances to people who they know have lived in the country for generations but do not have their citizenship cards. So I'll stop here. I'll let respected Vishnu Yadav, who's the chairperson of Ward 11, who has kindly agreed to join us here from Bardia. He comes from Bularia municipality. He's going to speak about some really commendable and I should say brave approaches to address the challenges for people in their constituency who do not have the citizenship. So Vishnu sir, I'm handing this over to you. The floor is all yours. And Vishnu sir will speak in Nepali for those of you who need interpretation services.
सबैजनामा नमस्कार, म विष्णु यादव बुलेरियागारको वडाध्यक्ष। आज यस विषयमा बोल्न पाउँदा एकदमै खुसी छु। आजको समयमा यो कागजपत्र विहीन धेरै बालबालिकाहरू छन्, धेरै मान्छेहरू छन् र हामीहरू स्थानीय सरकारले विभिन्न प्रकारका कागजात बनाइदिन्छौँ, जस्तै बच्चाहरूको हकमा जन्म प्रमाणित बनाइदिन्छौँ, जसबाट बच्चाहरूले शिक्षा, खोप लगायत अन्य सेवा सुविधा जुन छन् सही तरिकाले पाएको छन्। शिक्षाको क्षेत्रमा उहाँहरूले निर्धक्क रूपमा जन्म प्रमाणितले काम गरेको छ। त्यस्तै गरी जुन नागरिकहरूसँग नागरिकता छैन र हाम्रै नेपालको बासिन्दा हुन्, हाम्रै वडाको बासिन्दा हुन्, तिनीहरूलाई हामीले स्थायी बसोबास बनाइदिएका छौँ, जसबाट उहाँहरू एक ठाउँ छोडेर एउटा सहर छोडेर अर्को सहरमा पनि देखाएर काम गर्न पाउनु भएको छ र जसबाट भेदभावबाट जुन उहाँहरू बच्न सक्नु भएको छ। यसै गरी यही स्थायी बसोबासले हाम्रो छिमेकी मुल्क भारतमा पनि त्यसले मान्यता प्राप्त गरेको छ र उहाँहरूले पनि त्यही कागजातको आधारमा उहाँहरूले त्यहाँ पनि रोजगार प्राप्त गरेको छन्। यसै गरी आमाको नागरिकता नभएको बच्चाहरूको पनि जन्म दर्ता हामीले सजिलै गरिदिइराखेको छौँ, जसबाट उहाँहरूले पनि निकै नै फेसिलिटी पाउनु भएको छ। यसै गरी यो हाम्रो जुन जन्म प्रमाणित अनि रोजगार जन्म प्रमाणित स्थायी बसोबासले बच्चाहरूलाई शिक्षा अनि स्थायी बसोबासबाट रोजगार गर्न एकदमै सहज भएको छ। यद्यपि पनि कागजपत्र बन्नुपर्ने कुरा हो, तर त्यो विभिन्न कारणले नबनेको हो। कतिपय मान्छेहरूको इच्छा शक्ति नभएर पनि बन्न सकेको छैन पहिला विगतमा। अहिले धेरै जसो मान्छेहरू कागजपत्र प्राप्त गरेका छन्। स्थानीय नागरिकता ऐन आएपछि पनि धेरै जनाहरूले नागरिकता प्राप्त गरेका छन्, जसको उहाँको नागरिकता थियो जन्मसिद्ध जन्मको आधारमा प्राप्त गरेका थिए, तिनीहरूको छोराछोरीहरूले नागरिकता प्राप्त गरेका थिएनन्। अनि नेपालमा हाम्रो गएको वर्ष आन्दोलन भयो र त्यस पश्चात धेरै लगभग लाखौं युवाहरूले नागरिकता प्राप्त गरेका छन् र उहाँहरू आज नेपाल सरकारको गभर्नमेन्ट जबमा हुनुहुन्छ, विभिन्न अपर्च्युनिटीहरू क्रिएट गरेको छन्। त्यसै गरी नेपालमा अझै पनि धेरै बासिन्दाहरू छन् जसको जन्म दर्ता छैन, नागरिकता छैन, उहाँहरूसँग कुनै प्रुफ छैन, उहाँहरू नेपालमा बसिरहेको छन् र हामीहरूले जन्म प्रमाणित गर्दाखेरि, स्थायी बसोबास प्रमाणित गर्दाखेरि सम्बन्धित ठाउँमा गएर 5 जना मान्छेलाई राखेर वास्तविक बासिन्दा हुन् कि होइनन्, कहाँदेखि आएको सबै कुरा क्लियर गरेर हामीहरूले यो विषयमा जन्म प्रमाणित र स्थायी बसोबास गरिदिइराखेका छौँ। यसै गरी हामीले महिलाहरूको हकमा मानव भारतका महिलाहरू हाम्रो देशमा बिहे भएको छ भने उहाँहरूको बिहा प्रमाणित गरिदिएको खण्ड हुन्छ, किनकि धेरैजनाहरूको श्रीमानसँग सम्बन्ध विच्छेद हुने कन्डिसनमा मुद्दा लड्नको लागि अदालतमा जानको लागि उहाँहरूलाई बिहा प्रमाणितले बिहा दर्ता सरहै नै काम गरेको हुन्छ र उहाँहरूले हाम्रो श्रीमानबाट पाउनुपर्ने हक अधिकारहरू उहाँहरूले सजिलै तरिकाले प्राप्त गरिराख्नु भएको छ।
I'm going to switch to English. So thank you, Vishnu sir, for the insights and for some of the examples that you've been doing. I'd like to highlight that these registration document which certifies that they are living in Nepal in a particular area, has also help people to go to India for their daily for livelihoods, because now what has happened is without citizenship or any form of identity, people cannot move across the border to India. They are stopped by the Indian police. And for those of you who know Nepal, it's not only about livelihoods, but it's also about family relationship. There is intermarriage between Nepal and India. So if you don't have a citizenship, you are not, you would not be able to go to meet your families in India if you're married from there. So this making of interim document has helped people travel across the border as well, just to add from what Vishnu sir said. So Yuki, I don't know if we have passed the time, if we are over the time, but I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Anita and Vishnu and all the other earlier speakers. Thank you for sharing insights both globally and from Brazil, Kenya, Nepal. We've covered a lot of grounds today, and from examining the impact of not having documentation to understanding how people end up in these situations, to looking at examples from Nepal, to exploring policy solutions. So now I'd like to open the floor up to questions from our audience. Again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to address them in the time that we have remaining. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I would just like to remind everyone that the report is now live. It's available on the Freedom Fund website. You'll see a link there, as well as in the chat as well. So I can already see some questions popping in. So I might throw the first one out to Heaven and the global team, because it's been a question that's specifically about the UNU's recommendation. So Heaven, there's been a question around the recommendation that digitalization offers a promising solution, but it may also risk excluding certain groups, such as refugees, internally displaced people, and people from marginalized communities. So what recommendations would your team propose to enhance and make sure that inclusivity of digital ID is thought about from the onset?
Thank you, Yuki, and thanks for the question. I'm going to make a few comments, then hand over to Angharad, and possibly also Tanya may have some examples of this. We don't really recommend digitization in the report. We mention it because we're aware that it's an increasingly important strategy in relation to documentation in the global north as well as the global south. The reason why it's become increasingly popular is because it obviously improves data collection, it improves potentially service delivery, and it can improve the targeting of welfare initiatives. But it has to be said that there are lots and lots of question marks around digitization. And those question marks exist globally, not just in the global south. But I think in the global south, there's three main concerns. One is around capacity and resources, because of course, many of the technological systems for digitization are not as developed in the Global South because the resources are ultimately less. The same privacy and data misuse concerns around personal data exist in the South as they do everywhere else. And I think that links to the third concern, which is around this exclusion point, that if a community is already excluded because politically it has been excluded by the government, it's not the case that digitization would be a panacea for that, because on the contrary, as the questioner rightly points out, it can actually exacerbate and increase the marginalization and exclusion of those populations, not least because there's then a presumption that everyone should have a digital identity, which is not the case. So it's certainly not a panacea. I think we mention it in the report because we think it's important to acknowledge that it's an increasing trend in relation to issues of documentation. But there are lots of unknowns, and those unknowns are even greater in the context of Global South because, of course, these issues are less researched. And Howard, I'll hand over to you. You might want to add to that. And as I say, Tanya may have some examples of where it has or has not been effective.
Sure, and thank you for the question. Digitalization is a really important topic to debate and discuss, and it was a concern that came up a lot during the interviews at the amongst the global actors who expressed concerns about hastily implementing digital systems in contexts where they might not be suitable and in fact might do more harm than good. So I'm glad that we're discussing it now. And again, just to reiterate, that is why our report emphasizes that digitalization, when considered, must be tailored to meet the specific needs of each community, considering diverse levels of technological literacy and access, and why we don't include it as one of the 5 policy recommendations due to the need to kind of consider contextual factors when implementing these systems. In terms of the latter half of the question, which was a question around what do we need to consider around standard operating procedures, I can briefly touch on them, but it would be great to kind of get Tanya's insights. I think, primarily it needs to comprehensively address local needs through extensive community assessments and consultations. So systems should be universally accessible, incorporating design principles that cater to all users, providing various access points such as online platforms, and complementing this with mobile applications and physical kiosks as well. Digitalization should ensure that the services are in multiple languages of the communities that they're working with. And I think equally important, aligning with this, is the development of local capacities as well. So training community members and officials to use and support the system effectively, whilst also running educational campaigns to highlight the importance of digital registration. And as mentioned, Heaven mentioned, ensuring robust data protection measures as well. But Tanya, if you could jump in with any kind of additional points, that would be great.
I mean, you guys have both mentioned some really fantastic elements. I think what we see often is the digitalization of systems are seen as a bit of a solution to everything, and it's not. If the underlying processes are not inclusive before, they're not going to become inclusive because the system is suddenly digitalized. I think what digitalized systems can do is that it can improve the resilience of the systems. So in case of shocks, natural disasters, and so on, which can in turn also help individuals who've lost documents retrieve those documents. So that's a pretty, direct potential that could have for these for particular groups. I think also there are some possibilities of digitalization kind of facilitating outreach facilities and facilitating, easier registration processes for individuals, which again can make registration more likely for the general population. But I think we have to be very careful in general to see digitalization as a solution in itself. It is by no means a solution in itself. And I think that's a key message to get across. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sort of giving us a really well-rounded perspective about digitalization. I wanted to now pass over a question to Nepal. So in one of our audiences asked, in the Nepal research, wondered if you looked at the specific problems faced by Nepali migrant workers in terms of not having access to documentation or maybe getting their documentation taken away by their employers. Anita?
Thank you, Yuki. And thank you, Somsar, for the question. I know that you've been doing a lot of important work related to documentation and policy intervention for migrants. If your question was about the children of women migrants, we have briefly touched upon it in the key informant interviews, but because of limited funding, we focused on some groups where there's comparatively less research. In terms of documentation of the migrants, I know that you've been doing a lot of work, Meena ma'am has been doing a lot of work, and Sakti Samwa and other groups from returnees migrants are doing a lot of policy advocacy, thanks to which we have new amendments in the Citizenship Act now. So our focus was mostly in the Tarai region, mostly with the previous bonded laborers and communities which are largely have a long history of traveling back from like having origins in India, who have lived in Nepal for generations without having the citizenship card. So to say, like, we know the issue is important, we did some key informant interviews around it, but the case study was in the field was not explicitly focused on migrant population. And in terms of, if your question was about Nepali migrants whose documents are confiscated, for example, in the Gulf countries, we discussed a lot when we developed the project, but because of funding issues, we were not able to cover those people. Yuki, sorry, over to you.
Thank you, Anita. And I guess to add that, I'm hoping that this project is just at the beginning of gathering more evidence around this issue. And as Anita mentioned, we couldn't cover all of the things we would like to, but we certainly would like to focus on many other groups that are excluded. And I think migrant workers is definitely a group that we didn't quite have the resources to reach, but is one that we hope that there'll be more evidence around. So Tanya, thank you for joining us. So there is a question that I'd like to direct to you, which is, so as you may know, in the Kenya's effort to digitalize, they have also been increasing the fees for accessing crucial documentation, such as for birth certificates and ID cards. Wondered if this sort of fee increase has happened in other contexts, and sort of what is the potential solutions around making sure that there's still access to low-income groups.
Thank you so much. And I will definitely not claim to be an expert on the Kenyan case because I've never worked in that region. But unfortunately, we do see some countries changing and increasing fees on birth registration, which is obviously very much against the international recommendations. I mean, birth registration should be free, and that is a very clear UN recommendation. There will always be some level of cost for families to register the child, even if there is no fee in itself, because there will be, a cost of traveling to the registration office or just time filling in documents or whatever. But we really strongly advocate for registration fees to be abolished. And it's quite unfortunate if some countries are increasing the fees. Ideally, we would have no fees, at least in birth registration, to ensure that everyone has that very crucial legal documentation. So that one is a fairly straightforward answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Got a question over for the Brazil team. So this relates to the link between the lack of documentation and criminalization. And what were your findings in this regards? And I think especially in Brazil, where you looked a lot at the situations of migrant workers. Can you tell us more about the linkages between documentation and criminalization?
Yes, thank you, Yuki. And we are going to answer to this question three moments, but rapidly. The first moment is to say, of course, not having documentations already locate you in society and places you at risk to be excluded, from services, from access and to protection and so forth and so on. So not having documentation is a primary kind of defining factors that, that explain that you are not a citizen, you are not participating in the community. How does it play in Brazil? Victor is going to give you a rapid summary of it. And then after that, I would like, if you can, Carla, to just talk a little about, rapidly about one experience, so then we can convey that to the world. Go ahead, Victor. Unmute yourself.
Ok, obrigado pela pergunta. Eu acho que quando eu vejo sua pergunta, ela me remete a dois aspectos que apareceu para a gente na pesquisa, dois aspectos que apareceram para a gente na pesquisa que nós consideramos importantes. Um primeiro é que imigrantes indocumentados no Brasil, muitas vezes, eles se veem numa situação em que eles precisam se deslocar para áreas das cidades, principalmente nas grandes metrópoles, onde o problema da violência é maior, onde onde há maiores índices de violência. Então, essas pessoas se tornam muito mais vulneráveis a situações de maior perigo pelo fato de que elas estão em maior vulnerabilidade social por estarem indocumentadas. Então, é claro, isso vai gerar um grande impacto na vida delas, porque, por exemplo, dependendo do local em que você vive, você pode ter algum tipo, por exemplo, de restrição de mobilidade. Você não pode sair tão tarde da sua casa, ou você não pode ter um trabalho que você volte tão tarde para sua casa. Então, nesse sentido, o que a gente percebe é que essas pessoas estão muito mais expostas a situações de criminalidade, de violência. Esse é um primeiro aspecto. Um segundo aspecto que eu acho importante salientar e que a gente está vendo isso nesse momento é que há um processo de criminalização de certas questões referentes a imigrantes. O que eu quero dizer com isso? Muitas vezes as pessoas, por estarem indocumentadas, e aí elas acabam tendo dificuldade de acesso ao mercado de trabalho, elas passam a atuar no setor informal. E no momento que elas passam a atuar no setor informal, a sua prática de trabalho passa a ser criminalizada. A gente tem visto isso com muita regularidade agora, isso está acontecendo nesse momento em São Paulo. Carla pode mencionar isso com mais propriedade do que eu, em que pessoas que vendem, realizam um comércio, que trabalham nas ruas em São Paulo, estão sofrendo por ações truculentas da polícia, que recolhem os seus materiais, as prendem, as agridem por vezes, pelo fato de que essas pessoas, por terem dificuldades de documentação, se veem impossibilitadas, por exemplo, de acessar o mercado de trabalho formal. Mas, enfim, eu passo para a Carla para que ela possa comentar também. Obrigado pela pergunta.
Olá, rapidamente, você pode nos contar uma experiência a partir do seu ponto de vista? Vai.
Obrigada. Então, uma experiência que está acontecendo agora, já que o Vitor tocou nesse assunto, está acontecendo nesse momento, inclusive estou com fotos aqui que depois posso compartilhar com o professor para que ele mostre o que vem acontecendo no Brasil. Por questão de documentos, eles trabalharam informal, e isso acontece com muita frequência. Um haitiano em específico foi defender uma moça que estava trabalhando de informal e que moram em ocupações, porque aqui em São Paulo moram em ocupações, que também é uma moradia irregular. Quando eles não vão para a extrema, para as periferias, eles acabam ficando em situações também de alta vulnerabilidade, morando em ocupações e que muitas vezes também é dominada pelo crime. Então, neste caso, essa moça estava trabalhando e a polícia, com forma muito truculenta, chegou para tomar suas mercadorias, e o rapaz foi defender e ele ficou preso. Ele está preso, claro que a Defensoria Pública, e aí existe toda uma questão aqui que a gente está em movimento para defender essa pessoa, que está preso injustamente, inclusive a que está presa tem documentos, e a que ele foi defender está sem documentos. Mas os dois têm algo em comum. Além de estar sem documentos, são pessoas negras. De novo, uma transversal que existe aqui no nosso país. Então, é muito interessante a gente ver. E fora isso, eu tenho um caso extremamente sério de morte que a gente atendeu, um que sobreviveu e o outro que faleceu de exaustão no serviço. Ele estava em Santa Catarina e de Santa Catarina vieram trazidos para São Paulo. Geograficamente também foram separados, porque o Brasil é bem grande. Isso, e sem avisar a família, sem nada, ele simplesmente foi enterrado como indigente. Então, isso é muito complicado aqui no Brasil. Essas são experiências dolorosas para a gente.
Muito obrigado mesmo. Thank you, Yoki. I pass it to you now.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience in the case as well, Carla. It really helps us understand the issue by looking through the specific lens of this case. I'm now going to hand over to Kenya. The question I have is around the digital ID initiatives that have been going on in Kenya for quite some time now, and have come across a couple of challenges, not only in terms of the fee hikes that was raised in different question. And I think the question from the audience is around, how is that going? Has it been useful? And how do we make sure that these efforts aren't excluding some marginalized groups? And if you can talk about what has happened in Kenya, that would be a really great illustrative example.
Okay, great. Well, in Kenya, we've had two processes. Well, one major process, which was called the Huduma number. And that was supposed to, it's like a one-stop shop for all your information, including IDs. And that initially, when they initiated that process, it was actually under a rush, and it was under certain circumstances that make people feel uncomfortable, meaning that if you did not register, you will not access services, you'll be denied services. So people did it in a panic. But then questions about data protection came up, questions about access to registration for these groups that we're talking about and others that actually emerged that would not have access to documentation, including refugees and asylum seekers who were told they wouldn't be able to access phones or even banking services. So the digitalization process has good intentions, but it did not factor different marginalized groups that will actually be further marginalized because of the digitalization process. This process was done it was a tablet, and it was quite quick and easy. But then I think they did not think about those communities that already lack documentation and how they're going to bring them into the system and the process. So as much as it has good intentions, I feel like it put more people at risk of being undocumented. And also it will also lead to certain groups being excluded, such as the hard-to-reach populations that may not have access to those registration centers. And it's also an expensive venture. It's not something that you can just do overnight. It has been an ongoing process, because obviously new people get registered at different stages. So this process still needs to be worked on. Recently, they were looking at it from the Maisha number, although they did not make it mandatory. The concept was basically the same, but they had not addressed the key issues about access for those people who do not have documentation. So I feel like there's still a bit of work that needs to be done at the government level to bring to create pathways for those people to actually be able to register, and also to not make it very difficult, because it could be that aspect where they may be able to register, but they may not have certain documents that they require at that registration process. I would actually want to bring Ben in and give him a chance to give his insights on this topic, because it's quite debatable at this moment. So Ben, if you're there, I can't seem to see you on my side.
I'm here. I hear you perfectly, and like to talk on the revised fees. You find that way back we had to pay 100 shillings for a new ID and 300 for a replacement. But currently we have to pay 300, which is around $3 for a new ID and $8 for a replacement. What is this telling us? This is simply telling us that we are being blocked from being documented as young people of Kenya. You'll find that this young person is not employed, but at the same time, he requires the documentation to be employed. He can't provide for the fees. It's just a system that is opening a pathway on the one side and closing another on the other side. So people are just in a loop of being undocumented. And as a young person, documentation is necessary. As you walk around, you might meet with the police. That's the first thing they'll ask for. So the system is just put against being documented. Secondly, on the digital system, it's good. The world currently is going into the digital era, which is very nice, but we still need to work on the old system thoroughly, because many people are having trouble with the old system. It still gave many people headaches. Here's the digital system, which requires even more information, which is very strict and must be true. Here is the digital system, which requires a very thorough assessment of the information given out. What of that person who doesn't have every information, not privileged to have maybe the parents' information or the guardian's information? The information is very limited. The digital platform won't accommodate this person into being documented. So I think we still need a lot of work to be done. We still have to work on the basic documentation processes, and we can incorporate the digital system slowly, as we work on our old system, as it tries to accommodate all of us. Then now we can incorporate the digital system of documentation. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much, Ben. And maybe I'll just add one last point. We have existing organizations such as Maono and other organizations working at a local level, and the Nyumba Kumi system, the 10 houses system, where people know the community members. So there are people on the ground that can actually be part of the process, and it can be an inclusive process for them to tell them, these are the communities that lack documentation, these are the issues they're facing. And it will be important to bring them to that process and not make it something that is just implemented without community engagement. So I feel like sometimes that's the missing component, community engagement and working with local organizations on the ground. So over to you, Yuki.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for, again, Ben, giving us some very concrete examples from your work with young people. Now I'm going to kind of go back to the global level, and we have a question here for Heaven and UNU colleagues. So it is around, what did you come across in both your research, desk research, as well as the in-country research, situations where state authorities deliberately stripped people of their nationality? Do you have recommendations for how, as civil society groups and aid agencies, how we can address these situations?
Thank you, Yuki. Thanks for the question. To be honest, the research didn't look at this particular issue, so I'm very reluctant to say anything substantive about it. I think the thing that's important to say is that nationality and documentation are not the same thing. So you can be someone who's within a country and not either a citizen or a national in that sense, and still have issues around documentation. So I think it's really important to differentiate the different types of documentation that people are able to have. And the fact that particularly migrants, obviously, and refugees, it takes them a long time, if ever, to get citizenship and nationality. So what we're looking at is other kinds of documents that people might have. So yeah, I mean, this is really from other research that we've done at UNU-CPR. I think this research didn't focus on that because you'll have seen from the diagram, we were focusing more on pathways into documentation rather than pathways out of documentation. But I'm sure that other people may have some things to say on that, possibly Tanya. And Howard, you may also want to add, but I'm reluctant to say too much just because we didn't do the research on that particular topic.
And Harry, did you have anything to add from the desk research?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to reiterate Heaven's point, this wasn't the primary focus of our research. But I think, you know, in situations where state authorities deliberately strip people of their nationality, I think it's crucial, therefore, to kind of leverage international advocacy, utilizing bodies like the UN to pressure states to adhere to human rights standards, to create this external accountability. But other than that, I think I'll pass over to Tanya in case she's got any specific examples to draw from her work.
I don't really have any specific examples. I mean, I was very happy that Heaven mentioned the distinguishing between birth registration and citizenship. I think it is extremely important that we don't conflate those two issues. And there's a lot of international guidance on that as well. We also have provided some information on that. And if anyone goes to our website, there's some documents on that issue as well. Because we really want, of course, we would like everyone to have citizenship as well, don't get me wrong, but it is the first step towards citizenship is to have any sort of legal documentation, right? And birth registration, that first step. So we would not want countries to not register children because they don't want to give them citizenship. We want them to register all children, independent on whether they're granting them citizenship. And there is a lot of confusion where those processes are intertwined too much. Ideally, they should be separate processes, right? So, yeah, so I just want to focus on that issue. I think it is really important to not conflate those two issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. Maybe just to add as well, there's a whole other, if you like, category, and it's very broad around statelessness. And, you know, again, we don't want to conflate statelessness with a lack of citizenship and nationality, but I think the possibility of people becoming stateless where they have a lack of access to documentation is very significant. And certainly other research that we've done as part of the MIDEC hub has been really looking at where children are unable to get their births registered in the countries to which they move, but also unable to become registered in the countries from which their parents originate. They effectively become stateless. And again, it would require additional research to say what the increased risks of modern slavery are with statelessness, but one would conceive and imagine or hypothesize, based on this research, that that population would also be vulnerable potentially to modern slavery, because again, they have no recourse, not just to the documents that allow them to access education, work, social services, but also to the possibilities of doing anything about any kind of exploitation or discrimination that they may face. So I think we could hypothesize that statelessness would add to that risk. But as Tanya says, it's so important to differentiate between these different forms of documentation, because actually birth registration is incredibly simple, incredibly straightforward, incredibly cheap, doesn't take anything apart from political will. And that's altogether another topic entirely. So, yeah.
And it's really important to say, you know, just because a country gives a child a birth certificate, it doesn't necessarily give it any other rights, right?
Absolutely.
So it doesn't give it doesn't put any obligations on the country to provide, you know, education or healthcare, whatever. And I think it's really important that we distinguish these issues and say the first step is that every individual has legal documentation, right? And then there's a lot of other things that follows from that. But we want to make sure that these doesn't get conflated, because then it's very hard to get the political will to support the birth registration if the governments think that, well, if we provide the birth certificate to everyone, it will also give us a lot of other responsibilities. So I think that's really important. Thank you.
Thank you. And even though you don't have much to say, you actually gave us really important insights and reminders about making the distinction. So thank you so much. I'm going to go to the last question before we wrap up this session. So I apologize to those who submitted a question and we didn't have time to get to them. So the last question I'm going to throw over to the Brazil team and maybe Ben from Kenya as well. The question is about how does discrimination and xenophobia make it hard for people to secure official documents? Because I think we all, you know, hear a lot about legal challenges, practical barriers, but in terms of these sort of social norm challenges, could you give us some examples about xenophobia and discrimination being a barrier?
Thank you very much for this question. And let me let Victor start. And after that, Carla, rapidly, and then I will summarize. Go ahead, Victor. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Ok, mais uma vez também obrigado pela pergunta. Uma das questões que ficou muito evidente ao longo da pesquisa, e Carla também já mencionou, o professor Burns também mencionou, é a questão de que racismo e xenofobia são muito estruturantes das relações no Brasil. A gente percebe isso muito fortemente. E aí, pensando nos relatos que a gente recebeu no campo, me remete a pelo menos 2 casos de pessoas que falaram coisas nesse sentido para a gente. Que, era uma pessoa que procurou, por exemplo, um serviço de saúde. Lembrando que no Brasil, o acesso ao serviço de saúde ele é gratuito e ele é universal, independente da pessoa estar documentada ou não. E aí, quando ela procura esse serviço de saúde, ela é maltratada por não ser brasileira e muitas vezes por ser uma pessoa negra. E com isso gera uma experiência de a pessoa se torna refratária a procurar serviços públicos do tipo, eu não quero voltar nos espaços governamentais porque lá eu sei que eu sou maltratada. Isso aconteceu também num outro caso relatado para a gente em relação à assistência social, uma assistente social do Estado que maltratou um imigrante e essa assistente social, ela deveria ocupar aquilo que seria uma espécie de um nó nessa rede, porque essa pessoa ela tem como função perceber que esse imigrante está indocumentado e ajudar a encaminhar esse processo de documentação dessa pessoa, mas ela não só faz isso, como ela afasta o imigrante do serviço, e aí impede que essa pessoa se documente justamente por uma ação xenofóbica.
Vitor, eu posso cumprimentar você com alguns exemplos tristes, né? Mas são exemplos. Na área da saúde, como nós também gerenciamos abrigos, uma vez eu fui levar uma haitiana para ganhar o seu bebê e, claro, negra, tudo, e perguntaram para mim a primeira coisa, você sabe se ela é boa parideira? O que tem a ver, né? Mas ela não é brasileira. E o que sempre a gente se depara com situações como essa. E na questão de documentos, em geral, nós temos uma coisa muito forte, que é quando os imigrantes vão fazer seus documentos, eles, principalmente quem não tem embaixada ou quem não tem consulado, já tem dificuldades aqui no Brasil. E quando são imigrantes africanos ou de origens de outros países, mas que sejam negros, tem mais dificuldades, principalmente, bom, é horrível dizer isso, mas eles falam assim, para que você vai ficar aqui? Volta para o seu país. Não precisa você tirar documento. Para o serviço que você vai fazer, não precisa de documento, ou seja, geralmente os serviços oferecidos, mesmo eu já atendi gente, não é brincadeira, médicos, engenheiros, passar por essa humilhação de falar, não que um serviço seja menor que o outro, não é isso, mas de nem perguntar o que ele era, mas falar assim, olha, o serviço que você pode fazer é de faxina, ou seja, para limpar o chão. Mas, olha, eu tenho experiência, eu posso ajudar, nem que seja voluntário. Não, né? E não esperam nem ele acabar de falar. Então, a gente tem todas as dificuldades. E quando é na fila também da Polícia Federal, porque os documentos são na Polícia Federal aqui, a gente vê muita discriminação entre negros e brancos. Isso o tempo todo, infelizmente.
So, thank you, Carla. So I'm going to pass to Ben, but just before that, I want to summarize in one point here, is that one of the discoveries from the field was that even having a documentation cannot be a predictor of having access to things that you need. And we have seen that in the context of many populations who have been marginalized because they are, migrants marginalized by xenophobia or by processes that are related to discrimination, racism, mere racism in Brazilian society. So Ben, we pass it to you if you are going to add something on it.
Ben, we'll give you the last word in the Q&A. If you're able to, you spoke a little bit about your own experience with the language requirement, but I'm wondering, as you're working with other young people in Kenya, whether you're also seeing other forms of sort of discrimination that stops people from accessing the ID.
Yes, we have come across just 100 meters from our organization. We have young child domestic workers who have come from countries like Burundi, Congo, even Rwanda, who we work closely with. The fact that they come from another country, which is not even closer, it has made it very difficult for them to actually acquire documentation. So some of the traffickers who are actually in Kenya take advantage of the situation and register them under their name, which makes them even more vulnerable into modern day slavery. So in midst of our work, we have come across so many others who are also from the border communities who have been actually subjected to even more humiliating procedures other than mine. And we have been able to take them through step by step. And I think also if we could get support from you guys, the Freedom Fund, to be able to help our young people in getting documented, getting these child domestic workers to be able to have to be able to have a dignified life. I think we could make a very huge impact. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for sharing the incredible work that you and your organization do. So we are almost at the end, and I just wanted to take a moment to ask all of our report authors to share a concluding thought. So I know we've covered a lot of ground today, but I do want people to make sure they have a clear takeaway as they finish this session. So in your view, what is the single most important action that you think is needed to address the challenge that you've raised today? So starting with Heaven?
Thank you, Yuki. It's a difficult question, but I'll answer it very quickly. I think the single most important thing is to bridge the policy practice gap, because actually there's plenty of things that are already in place. And if they were just implemented, then we'd find that many of these problems were solved. So SDG 16.9, as we said, is about birth registration in particular. We also have the Global Compact on Migration Objective 4. If you took those two things together, which the vast majority of states have signed up for, too, and it just did what they'd already agreed to do, then we really would be in a very different situation. So it's about implementation, and it's about the political will to put this into practice, not just for the sake of individuals, although as we've heard today, that's very important, but also in the interests of development more generally, and in the interest of implementing all the very many things that flow from having a legal identity. So yeah, political will for implementation. Thank you.
Linda?
Yes, it's very difficult to narrow down to one point, but I think it's about working from the bottom up, because we have a lot of organizations that are already doing the work, but they're not well resourced. And that could be an aspect where they already have a relationship with the community, with the different groups, as Ben has already elaborated. So resourcing those organizations to be able to take the services to the ground so that they can actually get the documentation, they can actually also do the awareness, the advocacy, because they'll be able to answer those key questions that they already have that are unique to them. So I feel like that could make a huge difference and could also influence policy responses or interventions going forward. Over to you, Yuki.
Hans and then Anita.
Okay, Yuki, and I would say that in the context of Brazil, I would have to repeat all the key recommendations that my previous colleagues already put out. But I would say the one thing that is important is that documentation issues are linked to systemic inequality, social inequality, racism, xenophobia, and so forth and so on. So that means that we need an integrated responses that places the organizations that are providing services at the core, because they are the one at the front line. And unfortunately, the kind of services that they can offer are services that are linked with individual projects. And when the life of the project ends, the services, they are totally disembodied. They cannot, they are disempowered and they cannot go beyond, the limits of a particular project. Again, the key point here is that to address this issue in a very systemic way. Thank you.
Go ahead, Anita.
Thank you, Yuki. I would say that's a more open approach that surpasses the traditional security threat notions states hold against people who do not have citizenship, like for them to be open, and policy amendments, including making interim ID cards that gives access to state basic services and social protection.
Thank you so much for reminding us some of these key actions. And I just want to take a moment to thank all of our incredible speakers for sharing your expertise today. And I know some of you have had to travel long distances to even get reliable internet connection. So we're so grateful for your time and insight. And also a big thank you to all of our participants for your active engagement and some tricky questions as well. A reminder that we have actually just launched this amazing research report. So what we've discussed today is only a fraction of what's in the report. So really invite you to take a read.